Welcome, everyone. We'll give it a couple of minutes. We're letting people into our virtual door at the moment, and we'll get started. We're expecting quite a few people this evening, so we're going to give it just a moment longer to let everybody into the virtual town hall. All right, welcome. Welcome to our town hall on the future of the Conowingo Dam cleanup and the massive threat the dam poses to the Chesapeake Bay and the Susquehanna River. I'm Robin Broder. I'm the Deputy Director of Waterkeepers Chesapeake, and I'll just be going over some of the meeting housekeeping details. This meeting is being recorded, and we'll provide that recording to everyone who has registered to the event. We encourage you to indicate in your rename yourself if you can, to indicate if you're with an organization. That would be very helpful for us tonight. And we suggest that you, well, more than suggest, that you keep yourself muted and your camera off tonight. And I would recommend viewing the event in the speaker view. We will take a few minutes to have a moderated discussion with our presenters, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. You can add your questions in the chat, and we'll address those later in the town hall. If you have any technical questions about Zoom or anything like that, you can address them directly to me, Robin Broder, or Bernard Devlin with Waterkeepers Chesapeake. We would like to thank Mom's Organic Market for sponsoring tonight's event. And now I would like to turn it over to Betsy Nicholas, our Executive Director of Waterkeepers Chesapeake. Thank you.
Thanks, Robin. As Robin said, I'm Betsy Nicholas, the Executive Director of Waterkeepers Chesapeake. I've been working on the Conowingo issue for nearly 8 years, which is the full time I've been in this position. And part of the reason is that the Conowingo Dam is the single most important issue, as well as the largest threat to the Chesapeake Bay watershed, as well as our entire cleanup plan, also called the Total Maximum Daily Load, or TMDL, and pollution diet and blueprint and some other things. They're all the same thing of the cleanup plan. FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, just issued a license to Exelon Corporation to operate the Conowingo Dam as a hydropower dam on the Susquehanna River for the next 50 years. That license was issued only containing the grossly insufficient environmental requirements included in a settlement agreement that was reached solely between the state of Maryland and Exelon, not including any of the parties you have both in this panel or who have otherwise been involved in this process. That water quality, that license requires no specific pollution reduction measures, no significant restoration of mussels, eels, shad, or other species, and no plan to address the 200 million tons of sediment that are currently stored behind the dam. A water quality certification is the most important tool for a state when a federal project is being permitted or licensed in that state. In fact, it's really the only opportunity for a state to put some conditions on these federally licensed and permitted projects. The water quality certification process here was with Maryland, because even though most of the Susquehanna River flows upstream in Pennsylvania and New York, the dam itself is actually situated in the state of Maryland. And Maryland did issue a water quality certification back in March of 2018 with rather stringent requirements in it. One of the things that I'm going to focus on here a little bit is the nutrient pollution. Nutrient pollution in the form of nitrogen and phosphorus is one of the biggest threats to the Chesapeake Bay and really the focus of this entire cleanup plan, along with sediment, which is also a problem with Conowingo Dam. The water quality certification required 6 million pounds of nitrogen to be reduced, as well as 260,000 pounds of phosphorus every year for 50 years. That was an obligation that Exelon would have under that water quality certification. And if they wish to pay in lieu, give a payment for the cost of that instead, that would have been at $172 million a year for 50 years. This totals up to, when you consider inflation, somewhere around $8.5 billion over the 50-year license term. But that was not included in the FERC license. In fact, not only did FERC not include those requirements, the state of Maryland also waived their right to have a water quality certification, functionally waiving all rights under the Federal Clean Water Act for the next 50 years. And FERC thought this was okay. They issued this license without the nutrient requirements needed, without anything to address the tens of millions of mussels that used to be upstream on the Susquehanna, filtering pollutants and cleaning the water, that were lost due to the dam operations, without any additional requirements for eels, shad, and other fish to pass through the dam. And there were no requirements at any point in time for the 200 million pounds of sediment. And while it's not specifically an issue with the FERC license, this whole load of pollution factors into the Chesapeake Bay cleanup plan in another way. Since it wasn't originally accounted for when the cleanup plan, or the TMDL, was developed in 2010, a supplemental plan was developed focusing on this Conowingo pollution load. That plan includes the same 260,000 pounds of phosphorus and 6 million pounds of nitrogen removal per year, every year. But that plan doesn't have a funding mechanism. In fact, the Environmental Protection Agency just reviewed that plan and said it's little more than an aspiration without any means of funding it. And that's because Exelon isn't being held responsible. MDE let them off the hook, Maryland Department of the Environment, as well as the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And that means we get to pay. The taxpayers of all the Bay states will be on the hook for this pollution load coming from Exelon's operations of the Conowingo Dam if we don't do something about this. And that's why we're here this evening, to talk to you about the actions that we're taking and what we need to do. Just a couple of weeks ago, Waterkeepers Chesapeake, Lower Susquehanna River Keeper, Sassafras River Keeper, and Shore Rivers, along with Chesapeake Bay Foundation and represented by Earth Justice, filed an appeal of this FERC license, because we recognize that we have to fix this for the future of the Chesapeake Bay, our local communities, our fisheries, our economy, and our overall way of life here in the Chesapeake. So that's what we're going to dig into a little bit this evening with a great panel. And I would like to hand it over now to our amazing moderator, Mark Steiner, who many of you may know from his radio shows for years in Baltimore and other places, and from his Peabody Award, and also working with us in the past. So, Mark. You're still on mute. There we
It
go.
took a minute, but I got it. I'm unmuted. Okay, good. So thank you, Robin. I'm happy to do this evening. I think that this is a really critically important issue, and that's what we're going to get to, is how we got here, what we do about it, what's in the legal case, what the consequences are, and what the strategy is for changing this. How does it change? What do we do? And so let me talk about the folks who are on the panel. I think the screens are all the same as you're looking. So right next to me is Jim Pugh. Jim Pugh is a senior attorney with Earth Justice, one of the folks doing litigation there. Of course, you just met Betsy. And we have John Dawes with us. John Dawes is executive director, Foundation for Pennsylvania Watersheds, and a member of the Citizens Advisory Committee for the Chesapeake Bay Program. And next to Jim, let me get my name straight there. My next to Jim is Ted Evgeniadis. Did I say that right, Ted? I got your name right this time? Who is the river keeper at Lower Susquehanna. And next to him, we have Paul Small, who is the director of litigation for the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. And next to him is Zach Kelleher, who is the Sassafras River Keeper. So good to have you all with us. And I think we may have another guest coming, but if he does come, we'll jump in and invite him, of course. So I really do want to start this in some parts of the beginning. I mean, maybe a little beyond the beginning, because I think it's really important to kind of wrestle with how we got here from the time when we had the original water quality certification, with a public administrative procedure as part of it in 2018. And then all of a sudden it unraveled. Now, there's been a lot of intimation by some in the environmental movement and other places that there's collusion between Exelon and MDE or FERC, that was part of what happened. But clearly something happened. So how did it unravel? Is the question I want to wrestle with here. And I don't know if the legal minds want to jump in on this, or if that's something that we don't want to because they've got to fight this thing in court and don't want to prejudice their case. But let's begin there. And let me start with you, Betsy. You've been in this from the beginning. So what happened? I mean, what's reality here?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. And it's kind of confusing. Maryland was pretty strong and strident for years working on this. I mean, just going back through newspaper articles and looking at it, you're going to see commitments of Governor Hogan of, the Conowingo, we have to address this, we have to fix this issue. And then Maryland moved on and issued a pretty stringent water quality certification. It maybe didn't have exactly the same mix of requirements we would have liked to see in there, but it was stringent. It would have done a lot. That was immediately challenged in court by Exelon in administrative, state, and federal court. And those court challenges, coupled with some things happening outside of that arena, seemed to spook the state. And those were congressional action to attempt to roll back the water quality certification process under the Clean Water Act. In Congress, a Trump bill or a Trump executive order requiring EPA to draft regulations to roll that back, and then the subsequent EPA regulations rolling that back, as well as a court case in the DC circuit. So all of a sudden we kind of switched from working really alongside the state to the state working solely with Exelon, coming up with a very weak settlement agreement, and then waiving their rights under the Clean Water Act for the next 50 years. And maybe Jim, do you want to jump in a little bit on the legal here?
Sure. I guess this, Mark, this kind of goes to your question about what do we do? Because in the beginning of the process, Maryland identified what we do. That was the water quality certification. And I think it's important, at the risk of getting a little bit legal on this, to really say what this certification means, because the authority that Maryland has to certify the dam, to place a certification on the dam, is limited to what is necessary to bring the dam into compliance with water quality standards. So what Maryland actually certified, what it signed off on, is that all the requirements in that certification are necessary to bring the dam into compliance with water quality certifications. And what's so shocking is that the license that FERC just issued does not include any of those requirements. And it is not because Maryland or FERC or anyone else has ever said that these requirements aren't necessary. In fact, Maryland has never denied that they're necessary, and FERC says that whether they're necessary or not is irrelevant. So this is really the crux of the matter. There have been a lot of very specific steps identified as necessary to clean up the Chesapeake Bay and the lower Susquehanna, including, as Betsy mentioned, cleaning up that silted up giant reservoir behind the dam. And none of those steps are going to be taken under this license.
So let me kind of push that a little further, because I think this is really important. So the question seems to be, and I don't know who wants to jump into this. I mean, Paul Small maybe, or Ted Evgeniadis, if you want to jump in on this, Zach. That what is the politics behind this? If in fact they broke the law, if in fact they're not following the procedures, I should say, how did it happen? I mean, what is the politics that allows FERC and MDE to not put forth what has to be done? I mean, to me, that seems to be a critical question here, because that has to also goes into how you combat it, how you fight it, how you change it. I mean, how is it even possible that was allowed to happen? Is it just liberal conservative politics? Is something deeper than that? I mean, what is it? Paul, do you want to jump in? And then we'll go to the water keepers, let them have their say.
I can't speak to, alleged collusion or anything like that. I think you have to look at the role of the commission. We've seen throughout the watershed how the commission has aligned itself on pipelines. Only recently are they going to start considering downstream impacts to the environment from pipeline projects. We've been fighting pipelines across the watershed in Virginia. And here's another instance where, their objective is power, is the transmission of power, is a grid, making sure that this project is relicensed. So you've got that going for you on the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission front. And then you've got a large organization or corporation that can bring to bear very fine attorneys and can litigate this matter on three fronts. So, and as Betsy laid out, you've got potentially adverse decisions coming out of the DC Circuit, which is often referred to as, the minor league for the Supreme Court, which may or may not be binding on other decisions involving the commission before that forum. So I think it was a combination of factors, just from kind of a non-controversial analysis of what was going on, and here we are. Perhaps Ted and Zach would like to kind of.
Yeah, I'm curious to get to Ted, let me start with you and then go jump in. Zach, please jump in as well. I mean, it's from on the ground, because you've been doing the battle on the ground. So talk a bit about your perspective on how this could have happened.
Sure, thanks, Mark. So I mean, my personal opinion is it's pretty simple. The DC Circuit Court case that Betsy mentioned, that Paul mentioned, it was all about waiver of a certification where, not to get in the weeds a lot on this, but it was out in California. The state power company deliberately delayed the issuance of a water quality certification under the Clean Water Act under Section 401. The state has exactly 1 year from the time the dam owner puts out their application for that 401. The state has 1 year to issue it. In that case, it was deliberately delayed. So in that case, the court decided that 1 year means 1 year. Exelon then petitioned FERC and said that Maryland had waived their right to a certification because Maryland needed more information in 2014. A couple years went by. Exelon withdrew, resubmitted their application because Maryland told them that they were going to deny it outright. They didn't have the studies that they needed. So when the water quality certification was then issued in 2018, and Betsy mentioned it was fought by Exelon in courts, I believe the state was very fearful. The state was afraid of what would happen if they had actually waived, even though they didn't whatsoever. I think Exelon put pressure on them, backed them up into a corner, and that's when they negotiated or were strong armed into this settlement agreement with Exelon. And given that, it was just mentioned that Paul said that this company is a beast. Exelon is the most profitable company in the entire most profitable energy provider in the entire country. In 2019 they made $34 billion, and they generate a lot of income just off the Lower Susquehanna. They own Conowingo Dam, they own Muddy Run Pump Storage, and they also own Peach Bottom Nuclear Power Plant. You're talking millions and millions of dollars that are coming out of this thing. So again, Exelon or Maryland was backed into a corner. They engaged into the settlement agreement because, again, they were fearful that they would either, fight this out in court with their limited resources. Of course, Exelon has, they can get any attorneys they want. They can get any kind of lobbyists they want to put pressure on this issue. And that's what I think happened. It was a lot of fear involved in what would happen, for the future of the river and future of the bay. So they, negotiated this very weak settlement agreement and got what they got. Obviously, they didn't want to litigate it for years and years and years, wasting so many resources that they don't have as much as Exelon. So that's my opinion. And
So let me jump to Zach and John. I want to hear your thoughts on that as well. Zach?
Thank you. Just kind of building off of what Ted said, this is just kind of the latest example of a state agency and a federal commission bowing into political pressure and lobbying. And instead of protecting the downstream communities and the waterways that they're charged with protecting, they're choosing to focus on the most profitable utility company in the country, focus on their bottom line instead of the downstream communities. As Paul mentioned, the downstream communities were kind of an afterthought, and still up until now are an afterthought. So down here on the Eastern Shore, we're on the receiving end of everything that's coming through the dam and flowing down from Pennsylvania and New York. We're taking it in the teeth with all the debris and the sediment and the pollutants. And now we're on the hook to clean up and deal and address those issues because Exelon is not willing to contribute meaningfully to address these issues when they have the ability to. And that's kind of what this whole effort is about right now, is trying to right those wrongs, fight for our downstream communities, and protect our waterways and the water quality, because that's what we're all doing this for.
John, do you want to jump in on this as well before I push a little bit more?
I serve on the Citizens Advisory Committee for the Chesapeake Bay program, one of 3 advisories. And that committee is made up of educators and citizens and professionals from a diverse set of backgrounds. And for over 10 years have advised the executive committee, made up of the 3 governors of the Bay states, that the overarching looming threat to the Bay are the sediments behind Conowingo. That's been in every communication for a decade. And it has not been heard to result in this kind of a settlement.
So I'm going to push this up. I think this is really, am I muted? No, good. I couldn't tell for a second. I thought I was, sorry. So, I mean, let's push this a tad further then. I mean, so if what we're saying here in terms of the power that's being faced, the power of Exelon, and we look at all the ways, what has happened over since 2018, especially. So how do you fight back at that? I mean, here we have people in this room, legal minds, activists, people who protect our rivers. And so clearly something has to be built to counter that, because Exxon got off the hook and did not let them get off the hook in terms of cleaning up what we face with their payment in lieu of cleanup, which was absurd. So let's talk a bit about strategic, what that means, how you fight that. So first of all, let me turn to Jim and Paul just to talk about legally. I mean, there are a couple of things going on here. You have the politics of the power of Exelon. You've got an increasingly growing conservative court in the federal courts. That's a battle that has to be faced. So what, from that perspective, what is the strategy when it comes to appealing this and fighting this in the courts after the decisions were made? And I'll start again with Jim. We'll go to Paul, and just jump in, Paul, when it's time. So go ahead, Jim.
Sure. I mean, the courts are, in a sense, the one final forum where waterkeepers can stand up and be equal with Exelon. It doesn't matter how much money Exelon has. It doesn't matter how much political power they have. What matters is that FERC broke the law. And even a conservative judge will see that FERC broke the law when it issued the license. So the first step of the strategy is to take this, put it in front of a panel, whether it's a panel of conservative appointees or liberal appointees, and explain that this is a very simple, straightforward violation of the Clean Water Act, and have them throw this license out. Then we can start having a reasonable discussion about what to do next.
Paul, why don't you jump in if you'd like?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Jim. I mean, this is, if anything the prior administration taught us, not to get political, is it faith in the rule of law. We're here as a group, as a unified body of advocates and organizations to make sure we want Exelon to pay its fair share. This is all hands on deck. We need to get to 2025. We need to get to the finish line for the pollution diet.
What is 2025? What's the significance of
That's
2025?
the target date for the reductions of nutrients and sediment into the bay. And so we've got counties on the eastern shore. We've got farmers up in Pennsylvania getting work on the ground. We've got folks in Virginia, DC, parts of Delaware, who are we're spending money. Taxpayers are spending their money to get this work done. And when you've got Exelon that essentially litigated its way out of the commitments that Maryland required, that's a big problem. And it's speaking truth to power. It's doing the right thing, but it's holding folks to account. Why should downstream folks have to pay for this? This is an issue that may or could have been mitigated over the life of this project. So
I'm sorry, go ahead. No, go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you off. I'm sorry. I really didn't. I thought you had finished. I apologize. I'm going to go a little out of order here because I think that there are a lot of people who are writing in things, and these are relevant to the conversation we're having now. So let me just read a couple of things we can kind of wrestle with what people are looking at here. Jamie Baxter, CBFN, asked a question: was it fear of not getting anything from Exelon because of a weak legal backing, or fear of political backlash from their influence, or something else that led to the settlement? It wasn't clear from what Ted said. So let's talk about that. And if we can be kind of brief on our responses here to get to the point here, I'd like to do that. And let me add to this that Marie Laporte wrote, I think these things are connected. It seems hard to understand why they would agree to such long-term contracts. I could understand a 5-year or 10-year contract if they were pressed, but not the generational contract that's signed. Let's wrestle with these things for a moment. Ted, your name was called out. I'll let you jump in first, and then I want people to kind of weigh in on how this could happen politically and why it happened, which leads to what you do about it.
I'd answer the second question first. That's much easier and shorter.
Okay, that's good.
So the integrated licensing process for hydroelectric dams calls for those types of timeframes. So it can be anywhere from 30 to 50 years. In this case, for this license, it's a 50-year license. Going back to the other question, I mean, I would say it was fear of, I believe, not getting anything out of. It was fear of, and I'd maybe point to Betsy on this, but it was fear of not getting anything at all because of Exelon petitioned FERC stating that Maryland had waived their right to a certification. That could have led Maryland to thinking, well, if we did do that, even though they did not, what do we get? And that could be absolutely nothing. So in that case, they entered into settlement negotiations with Exelon, and this is where we're at with a majority of the settlement conditions are actually non-licensed conditions and are basically just a handshake deal, between Exelon and the state. So for example, the mussel hatchery that they want to build, FERC is not going to mandate that actually gets done. That's almost, a trust between Exelon and Maryland or Maryland itself that they.
But Maryland could mandate it if they wanted to.
That's right. And the 401 water quality certification as it stood, all of those conditions as they were are to be included in the federal license, no ifs, ands, or buts.
So, and Jim, I just want to ask you this quick question because the way the question was framed about the not having the strength of the legal team and all the money that Exelon has. I mean, I've been involved in different movement issues across the decades now, and it never, all the lawyers I've ever worked with who have fought different cases in our courts have never been fearful because they didn't have the means that Exelon has. So what does that mean that Exelon had the power and people who fought that didn't? Does that mean that it was I assume the AG's office who had this case and Brian didn't push it, which doesn't sound like Brian Frosch. So what happened? What does that mean?
I can't get into the heads of the people within the Maryland government that made this decision. All I can say is that it was a terrible decision. The litigation risks that they faced was not really that great. And what they were giving up was enormous. They gave up cleanup that was valued, by Maryland itself at over $8 billion. And they took a deal worth pennies on the dollar, maybe 100 million or 200 million at most. I don't think that much. So they basically, out of fear of I think, sort of a specter of litigation that was not a very real threat, they essentially gave away everything. And I know you're trying to get at the question of why and what was in their heads. I just don't know. It doesn't make any sense to me.
Mark, if I can add
I was about to call on you, Betsy. Please go ahead.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to add a little bit of sort of contextual flavor to dealing with FERC. And why, as Ted was speaking about, there were points at which the water quality certification was going to be denied because the information wasn't available. The information that was needed by the state of Maryland was asked for in the FERC licensing process at the beginning. There's a phase in which the company has to do studies. Maryland said, we need this information. Exelon said, we don't want to do it. FERC said, fine, you don't have to do it. And then when Exelon then applies for their certification, Maryland says again, we don't have the information we need. And then Exelon tries to say, oh, Maryland, you're going to run out of time. The deck is stacked here really badly. This is what FERC does. 99.4, I think, percent of pipeline projects that are requested through FERC are approved. There just isn't a really substantive review that happens there. And when you take into account the power dynamics, one of Exelon's subsidiaries just paid a $200 million fine for bribing officials in Illinois. Those government officials went to jail. And Exelon just kind of brushes that 200 million, which is more than they're paying in the entire 50-year license period for the damage to the Susquehanna River and the Chesapeake Bay communities. That they just paid that in a fine for bribing officials. So there, when you've got FERC as the agency looking over this, and that kind of power in a power company with money and political influence, shenanigans are going to happen.
So there are a lot of really interesting people in our audience, and they're raising some issues here that are directly related to this. And the things that, as the host, I should have thought of, but I didn't. But they have, so I'm going to share them. And I'm going to turn to Ted and Zach and John first to kind of jump into this and then come back to everybody else. So Patty McGrath has written a very long piece in here, and I'll try to kind of summarize a bit what she wrote, or he, I'm not sure which, but I mean, so said, why? I'm afraid that our politicians are in the pocket of Exelon. Senator Ben Cardin's actions relative to the new Clean Energy Act were completely anti-environmental, proposing billions of dollars to bail out retiring nuclear power plants. The funding would then not be available for new clean energy. Who owns the largest number of obsolete plants? Exelon. And goes on to say a group of senators last week filed a nuclear bailout amendment to the Clean Energy Act for America Act, which is currently a good renewable energy act. And Senator Cardin of Maryland, Bob Casey of Pennsylvania, and Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island submitted the changes one day before the scheduled markup by the Senate Finance Committee that would create a refundable tax credit for unprofitable reactors. So, and they could cost the taxpayers $50 to $100 million. So when you hear that, and these are, what should our response be? Because I look to the three of you for this moment, because your work is directly on the ground. You work with people every day who live by these rivers, whose lives are affected by this, and as a person who's been a kind of I was spent years as a community organizer. I mean, this seems to me to be ripe for building something to say, what the hell is going on here? And how does, and how you raise those issues to stop it. And Zach, let me let you jump in first.
I think that's a great question. And really, for the past few years, we really have been activating our communities that we represent. Back when there was a very limited public comment period for the proposed settlement that came out in October of 2019, we activated our communities immediately through a lot of outreach, social media campaigns, actions in the legislature at the state and federal levels. And we hosted in-person town halls back when we could have in-person events. And those events had hundreds of participants every time. And that led to thousands and thousands of comments from community members here directly being impacted by what's flowing through the dam and directly impacted by this issue. It led to thousands of comments from these community members that we're fighting for and representing being submitted as part of these comment periods. It's one of the issues that unites people from every stripe and every region of the Bay. And a lot of issues that we wouldn't necessarily agree on otherwise. This is one of those issues that ties everybody together because of how critically important it is to all the restoration work that we've been doing and how directly this impacts all of these downstream communities every single day that we're talking about it and fighting it in the courts and in the legislatures.
And John, what about in Pennsylvania? I mean,
Yeah, admittedly, the sediments, nitrogen and phosphorus are coming off of Pennsylvania non-point source pollution sites. And it's been estimated that Pennsylvania's shortfall in terms of dealing with their contribution to this issue is short $324 million per year based upon science and modeling. Pennsylvania doesn't have that money. There is no more room for more costs to Pennsylvania citizens to address this.
You're talking about the taxpayers? You're talking about what are you talking when you say Pennsylvania?
Taxpayers
okay.
Are on the hook in the Chesapeake Bay Agreement based upon the modeling that is, scientifically based in the Chesapeake Bay program, that to reduce Pennsylvania's amount of those three pollutants would cost $324 million more per year than what is available. Perhaps a hook is the fact that Conowingo itself has its own watershed implementation plan. And that is perhaps a legal hook that Betsy and Ted and Paul and James and Zach can deal with.
But Ted, I mean, that plan itself that John talked about is the one that was just clearly written over, that they paid no attention to when they created these new agreements, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the playing field from the start has always been, we've always been on defense. So, you have Exelon and, they tell everybody, that this dam has served as a best management practice for the bay, when that's entirely false. The only purpose this dam serves is to produce power. We had a hearing of sorts a couple years ago, and Exelon's lead attorney, David DeBruin, had said that scour has no bearing on the dam's operations, and that there's no
What
science.
has no bearing?
that
What has no bearing?
Scour.
Which
And
means
I'll,
what?
and I'll talk about that I'll talk about that just in a sec. And he said that scour has no bearing on the dam's operation, and that there's no science that shows the dam is causing harm to the bay. Absolutely false. This is a 94-foot tall hydroelectric dam built in 1928. It's been trapping nutrients and sediments behind it since that time. If they want to claim that it's a best management practice, it should have been, treated as such, where a lot of BMPs are maintained, for perpetuity. There was no routine dredging behind this dam. There was no mitigation since 1928. When 1972 and Hurricane Agnes hit, that was the most single largest destructing event to ever occur in our region. And quite frankly, we've been recovering from it since. And all the good work that people have been doing over the last 20 years has been to replace what was lost from that one storm. And to go back to, I think her name was Marie, Betsy just mentioned Exelon was charged with bribery. Going back to 2014 and even prior to that, you had a governor or someone that was running to be governor for the state of Maryland, Governor Hogan, repeatedly had said during his campaigns that one of my number one priorities is to hold Exelon accountable for the pollution that lays behind that dam. That
I remember.
affects the dam. And so here we are. We've spoken to a lot of watermen, a lot of captains around the bay. We've sent letters to Governor Hogan. They have sent letters to Governor Hogan. And there was an opportunity for Governor Hogan to take this deal off the table, and he didn't. So to answer the question about, is Exelon bribing elected officials? Well, we just saw an example of that, and I can't say, what legislators are taking money from Exelon if they are, but I wouldn't be surprised if they are, considering
to find out.
considering the climate that we're in. But, this dam has fundamentally altered, the lower Susquehanna River, its ecology. And, this dam, and this was from, I believe, a previous, I don't believe he's there now anymore, but Michael Padone had said it years ago that the Conowingo Dam is a loaded cannon pointed straight at the bay. And it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when we receive that next large storm, which is most likely going to happen in the next 50 years. So, we have a serious situation here that if we do get that next large storm like Agnes, the bay is dead. And that's it. So what do we do about it? Because what lies behind the dam now supersedes those pollutant levels that were there in 1972. So you're looking at catastrophe multiplied by however many times, right now.
So let me jump into this a bit here. There's a bunch of people written into the chat wanting to actually speak, which we can do in a little bit, and we'll get to you. I'll let some folks in, and we'll let them have their say. And if we do that, let me just say that there's some ground rules here. We have to keep it pithy and to the point because we have a time limit, and we have a lot of panelists, and we have a lot of folks here in the audience. But I will get to you. So this is. Let me see. Gotta figure out how to get this working right here. So these questions here, this one is a kind of a difficult question in a sense that it takes the environmental movement to task, and I can't seem to get this thing to drop so I can read the bloody question. All right, well, let's see if we can do this. Try one more time. So here we go. So Chip McLeod writes in saying we are here in part because the MDE issues its bold and historic WQC's on RE Conowingo Dam. Many entrenched environmental organizations were colluding to deny or downplay the Conowingo factor. for spurious reasons and diluting the state's leverage in negotiating with Exelon, a formidable adversary regardless of federal politics. Indeed, in its filings, Exelon has quoted the Chesapeake Bay Foundation's 2012 reference to the Conowingo factor as a red herring in arguments that MDE overreached. For the Clean Chesapeake Committee counties, the framing of this discussion is surreal. And Exelon and FERC relied upon this and more, which has been recognized as a predetermined report orchestrated by the same organizations. So, I mean, is it what? So, actually, there are a number of people who've written in like this, asking this question. And where was it that the fight wasn't hard enough? That was there a collusion that they're saying from the side we say is our side that's over here trying to fight to clean up the bay? Is that real or is that BS? So, what? And I'm only asking that because a number of people have written that in. Not something that I would even thought about asking. Go ahead, Robin.
Betsy.
Betsy, did I call you Robin? I'm sorry, Betsy.
That's okay.
I'm sorry, Betsy. I know the difference between you and Robin. Excuse me, I beg your pardon.
Well, I saw Paul was going to weigh in too, and I think you should, but since this was aimed at you, I thought it would be good for an ally working on this to weigh in first. And we were all with the state of Maryland. The state of Maryland was doing the right thing, and we were really pushing that forward. The bottom dropped out of this in the end of October in 2019. So for a process that started back in 2009, where we went off the rails, was actually quite recent. And so, the environmental community was supporting MDE taking a strong position on the water quality certification and holding Exelon accountable. The narrative just changed dramatically when they entered into that settlement agreement. So that's my little bit of background. And Paul, if you want to say anything, since you were called.
Yeah, I think to answer Chip's question or his allegation is that, Conowingo wasn't the silver bullet. His organization represented counties that didn't want to do their fair share of the work that other Marylanders were doing, that other jurisdictions were doing, and pointing the finger at the dam. And that's not fair to farmers who want to do the right thing. That's not fair to other jurisdictions in the watershed who are investing this money and these resources to get the work done. So we're all in this together. I mean, I know we got sick of that saying over the past 18 months, but this is a contributing factor. It's a big problem, but it's not the only problem, as John pointed out with the money problems that the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania had. So I think there's a lot of nuance here that kind of gets lost in jockeying for position.
I think so. There's a couple of litigation questions. So let me come to that, and I'll come back to some of the other issues. Scott Budden had written in, what are the potential outcomes of the lawsuit filing? And Tim Stambaugh, Penn State Master Watershed Steward, wrote in, how's the litigation going? Rich Hall of Chesapeake Legal Alliance asked, what is the litigation strategy for challenging MDE settlement of the 401 certification issue, which we should explain, and what relief will be requested? So who wants to jump in that first? Jim, you want to jump in first?
Sure, I'm happy to. And maybe I think I want to make sure I answer all of those questions. Let me start with the last one, or maybe one in the middle. We're not challenging anything except FERC's decision to issue a license here. And our strategy is very simple. We think that FERC lacked authority to issue this license. And if you want, I can say a little bit about that, if that would be helpful.
Please do. Yes.
What the Supreme Court has said, and this is well established, is that FERC has only so much authority as the statute gives it. It's a creature of statute. It doesn't have some broad ranging authority to issue licenses wherever it wants or whatever it thinks it's appropriate. It has limited authority. And one of the limits on that is that it cannot issue a license for any dam anywhere unless it does one of two things. It has to either include the conditions that a state certification has imposed on it, or it has to be able to show that that certification was waived by the state in the very specific way that the Clean Water Act provides. Now, there is a certification. You can You can go find it, you can hold it up, it still exists, nobody disputes that. And FERC refused to include the conditions in that certification in the license. So that's one option closed off to it. And the notion that Maryland waived its certification as the Clean Water Act requires is simply ridiculous. Maryland granted the certification within 1 year. And whatever this settlement, purported to do, when it came out, was long after the 1 year period. So FERC simply, if FERC wants to issue this license, it needs to put in the conditions that are in that certification. And if it doesn't want to put in the certification conditions, it lacks authority to issue the license at all. And the case is that simple.
I appreciate the clarity there. I raised it because there are a couple of people on this chat who have raised that issue. Who they are, I don't know, but I wanted to get it out there so we could kind of talk about it and thrash it out a bit. So coming up, right now, I mean, the issue seems to be really for us to tackle here, and some of the time we have is what are the consequences of this if nothing happens, and how would you all suggest that what happens to the future of Conowingo, what cleans it up, what makes it work? I mean, that's something I think that in all of this, the folks around the state of Maryland and in Pennsylvania, other places, even if they stand up and think something wrong, they want to hear what could be happened differently. What could be different, and how do we get there? Is a question I think we have to wrestle with for a moment.
Hey,
And
Mark, if you
I
don't
see
mind,
Ted is about. Go ahead, Ted. You were jumping through the screens. Let me let you go. Go.
you got to think about what happened here. The state of Maryland got nothing. We got nothing. This dam is going to cause so much harm when and if we get that large storm. But there's other stuff too. We got to look at fish passage. We got to look at the shad and eels that are essentially non-existent in this river watershed. But the point I wanted to make was that what happens here sets precedent for the entire country. Okay, so the reason is we have 3 other hydroelectric dams above Conowingo. All right, these dams are up for relicense in 2030. Safe Harbor Dam and the Holtwood Dam, or those 2 larger dams above Conowingo. You're looking at a 2030 date of relicensing, with the process starting in 2026. If Exelon can get away with what they just got away with, well, what does that mean for the other dam owners? Are they going to try to do what Exelon just did and skirt away from the responsibilities that they're going to have as well? So, it's important that we get this right and get it right now, because if we don't, there's going to be more consequences later down the road. And that's why, and this is another reason for Pennsylvanians and why this is so important, because what happens downstream can essentially happen again, and we do not need that to happen. We cannot have that happen. And these dams have to be properly mitigated. And if they don't, this conversation has been all about, well, who's going to pay for it? Who's responsible for it? And it's the dam owners. These dam owners have erected these dams that have changed the landscape of the river, have done harm, and continue to do harm. So that's a huge potential issue down the road.
I'm going to come back to where you left off, but let me jump over to Pennsylvania for a minute, John, since we talked about those 3 dams. Good.
I just want to build on Ted's analysis of the issue with Pennsylvania biological integrity. If we had a healthy mussel population, it could help reduce sediments, nitrogen and phosphorus, and help Pennsylvania meet its obligation. We've got, threats to Pennsylvania watersheds by not having those historic species. And I think that the track record of what's been done on the mandatory fish lifts is very, very poor. And in that sense, citizens of Pennsylvania should be just as outraged as those that are in danger. In terms of if and when an event happens, if Hurricane Sandy had come up a different pathway and scoured those 200 million pounds and had it gone over the top, 40 years of best management practices downstream could have been ruined.
So, does anybody else want to jump in on this before I move ahead with something? And some other people who have written in. Okay, because I do want to come back before we end the evening together is really strategically talk about what happens. What are the plans to organize and build to take to go ahead, Robin. Did I call you Robin again? What's
Yes.
my brain tonight? I think maybe I need some more sleep. Find yourself a new moderator. No, go ahead, Betsy. I'm sorry.
No problem. So, I mean, this is really just kind of echoing what was just said by Ted and John, but this isn't an issue just of looking at the Chesapeake Bay or the Susquehanna River. This is much bigger than that, both because of the legal side of the precedent, as well as the species that are impacted. So those species, they're anadromous or migratory fish. So they go back upstream to breed, but they don't just stay here, right? So when they come here and breed, then they go back out in the ocean. So this is depleting ocean populations. This is impacting the shad populations in New York and Virginia and across the East Coast. So if there's there's a lot that's being impacted by all of this, let alone, as Ted said, I mean, just in a really small segment of the lower Susquehanna, you got 2 more dams upstream. And if it's allowed to go forward, that something like a water quality certification can be issued. And then after the fact, they can say, oh, nope, we didn't mean it. We've decided we're not going to issue that. We're not going to go through a formal administrative process to withdraw it or anything like that that could be challenged in court. We're just going to pretend like it doesn't exist. What's to say that can't happen everywhere with pipelines, with everything else that is subject to 401? So that's why we need to, succeed in this lawsuit, but that doesn't end the story there. That will not give us all the restoration we need here from 90 years of Conowingo damage. We're going to have to look at additional policy and federal funding to ever get to the kind of restoration we need to have healthy fisheries and a healthy ecosystem.
So there's some other questions in here that kind of relate to this, some of these issues. An email came in asking, what are the results of the MES dredging pilot study, which I think is an important one for us to kind of wrestle with here. And is it true that dredging would only affect the sediment P load, which we can explain, as the nitrogen is 95% aqueous anyway? And can more be done to control the woodfall debris loading and to mitigate factors of such loads? Marinas and yacht clubs are suffering 3 years ago. That suffered 3 years ago. So let's talk a bit about that. Who wants to grab that one? Who feels capable of grabbing that one? Betsy?
I was going to say Ted and Zach both have a lot of experience of this.
All right,
so
then
Ted,
Zach, go. We haven't heard from you. Zach, please.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just 3 years ago. I know 3 years ago it washed up on the Western Shore and it was a big issue in Annapolis. But here on the Eastern Shore, we've been dealing with this issue for over 40 years now. All the stuff coming down that we've been talking about thus far, that's what's washing into our rivers. That's what's washing and smothering our oyster bars and our mussel restoration. So this isn't a recent problem, and it's going to be going on for the next 50 years. And it's going to set the national precedent that we've just been talking about, which is all the more reason we have to get it right now. And I'll still be here 50 years from now till I'm blue in the face until we have the proper water quality protections in place for our local rivers, for our bay, and for our communities that depend on them and live on these waterways. One of the arguments I hear a lot is kind of the defeatist tone of, well, the bay or the Conowingo Dam used to be a best management practice, but as Ted mentioned, best management practices need to be maintained. And so you kind of catch Exelon in their lie right there, that they're not maintaining this supposed best management practice. And I really disagree with the thought that just because it's worked or helped for the last 90 years means that we should continue to allow it to operate business as usual for the next 50. If we were still working and living like we were 90 years ago, nothing would be getting done. Everything else has changed. Everything else is updated. Technology's changed. Fisheries management has changed. Our restoration practices have changed and how we maintain them. Our priorities as a state and local communities have changed. So that's just how science-based adaptive management works. So why is it that dam management and addressing this issue is the one thing that's just supposed to be business as usual? And so we need to get this right. for our waterways and for our communities.
And just
Paul,
to
you were
touch
about-
on,
Paul wanted to say something, I think. Did you want to jump in, Paul? I saw your hand jump up.
No, I was just going to talk about sediment biogeochemistry, but I'm going to defer to Ted right now.
You can?
all right. Well, I'll say two things and then Paul pick it back up. So, you know, this dam has been, you know, as Zach said, it's been scouring, you know, nutrient sediments for a very long time. And the science behind that now is, you know, prior to this dam filling up, which they, you know, had said it was full in around 2014, 2015. The amount of river flow to create scour has dramatically dropped. So, you know, looking back maybe 10 years ago, you know, if the river was flowing, let's say 400 cubic feet per second, you know, we saw scour, those crest gates opened up and, you know, we got a muddy bay. So now it's actually a lot less. So we're looking at scour events occurring around 100,000 or 150,000 cubic feet per second, which if you remember in 2018, I don't think that the river was below 100,000 the entire year. I mean, we had so much rainfall and precipitation that, you know, flows were above and beyond that threshold. So, you know, if there's any watermen or captains on this call that work in the bay, I'd love to hear from you and your experience in 2018 when you had to shut down your business. There were a lot of captains in the upper bay. They had to cease their operations directly due to what was coming down from the Susquehanna River from behind Conowingo Dam and the amount of, you know, sediments and nutrients, which, you know, caused them to halt operations. I mean, that's a huge deal. We're looking at a commercial seafood industry in you know, the states of Maryland and Virginia north of $3 billion. You're looking at revenue in the hundreds of millions of dollars, you know, that can be wiped out again by one large storm. And to talk about dredging just for a minute, you know, it was said back in the day, well, you know, a couple of years back that, you know, dredging was off the table. It's not a Chesapeake Bay program, best management practice. You know, the costs are astronomical. You know, they're looking at $250 million or more per year to actually dredge. And what we found out, it's actually not that much. It's actually a lot less. There's a company called Harbor Rock. From the proposal that they actually sat in front of MDE and Exelon and MDE were kind of interested and curious about what they could do behind the dam, because they estimated that it would cost about $41 million compared to that 250 or north of that. So, and they have the capacity, the technology, and the resources to go in there, hydraulically dredge, situate a facility on the river down on Conowingo Reservoir, and have the opportunity to repurpose that sediment into lightweight aggregate or what have you. And also they would be able to, in real time, see the reductions in both nitrogen and phosphorus, in addition to any other pollutant that might be behind the dam. And they can essentially zap all of that stuff out and quantify it in real time. You know, where's that conversation at? And I think someone had just asked a question about where's the test pilot dredge, and
there's your answer. So John, were you about to say something before I move on?
Yeah, Mark, I work for the Foundation for Pennsylvania Watersheds, making small grants for restoration projects. And then some years ago, we made a grant to the lower Susquehanna River keepers to fund a bench scale test where Harbor Rock was making bricks out of the sediment. And it was successful on that scale. I do not understand, and I'd like to be enlightened and educated on this, why dredging it would be off the table. It's not rocket science. Those sediments came from Pennsylvania farm fields in many cases, and it, to me, would have some sort of value, economic value, as we talk about healthy soils, et cetera. Certainly there are problems. Their core samples would indicate pollutants and things that should not be stirred up. But as I said, it's not rocket science, and it seems to me there should be a positive scenario where this pollution could be seen as an economic asset.
So this might be a good time to kind of, in this last 25 minutes that we have together, to begin to explore what the alternatives are. And I'm talking about what is being pushed legally and what could come of that, but also what the alternatives are to Conowingo Dam. Someone texted me when they saw we were doing this last night saying, why don't you say just blow the dam up? That is one answer. And I don't know how feasible that is, but I think that, but maybe it's more feasible than I think. But let's talk a bit about what the consequence, because of the consequence of what's happened to the environment and happening to our rivers and happening to the business, and what can be a response that's different? What was a world that we could build that you could bring to people in the state of Pennsylvania, the state of Maryland, to say there is a different way? What is that different way? Which visionary wants to go first?
I wanted to actually give something exceedingly practical, so not very visionary.
Okay.
But the reservoir for Conowingo also operates two other facilities, one being the pump and storage at Muddy Run, the other being the cooling water for the Peach Bottom nuclear facility. So the fate of Conowingo also dictates the fate of these two other facilities, also owned by Exelon, one of them being a nuclear power plant. So it makes the concept of dam removal, or even just, we've heard, won't Exelon walk away? Well, they can't. There's indeed a federal process for that to even consider it, but they would also have to deal with their two other facilities that are codependent on Conowingo. So it's just a complex picture, and I just wanted to make sure that we framed it that way, that the sort of they're going to walk away or we're going to remove it aren't at this time realistic options, because we'd have to deal with those two other facilities. So now maybe to somebody visionary, that was not very visionary.
You're plenty visionary. So I want to go just around the room here and let everybody take in before we take maybe one or two callers before the end here. But I'm going to go to Jim Pugh, then I'm going to come right to you, John. Jim, why don't you leap in, then I'm going to go to John. We're going to go around the room.
Okay, well, I hate to be disappointing on this, but I think really a lot of this is that this is not to require a visionary solution. This requires that Exelon manage and clean up the giant reservoir behind its dam and do a much better job of allowing fish passage so that we're not destroying the fish migration there. And those simple things are well within Exelon's ability. I mean, I feel like a broken record a bit, but what everybody has been saying is that Exelon has allowed this reservoir to silt up. It hasn't been maintaining it. It hasn't dredged it. And so now it's full. And that means that routine events wash huge amounts of sediment and other kinds of pollution down the river and into the bay. If Exelon fixed that problem, that would go a long way to cleaning up and restoring the bay. But I'll leave the rest of this to other people who are more,
And that is part of the heart of the lawsuit, correct?
The lawsuit is just one tool in the box. And what the lawsuit is meant to do is to get rid of this license that would allow Exelon to keep operating the dam without doing anything to clean up anything significant for the next 50 years. Once we get rid of that, the rest of it is possible.
John, go ahead. And we're going to go down the line.
Just thank you, Jim, for keeping us on point. You're so right. I think it's on everybody's mind. What can happen if infrastructure is not maintained? We've seen it in the news day in and day out for the last 5 days. So thank you very much. Following up on use of sediments, just an idea, Pennsylvania has 119,000 dead toxic acres of mine land in the Bay watershed. And those sediments could be very useful in reclamation, keeping the heavy metals that are seeping off of those sites out of the Bay watershed, as well as sediment, nitrogen, and phosphorus, which is the responsibility of the Bay program.
What would that cost and what would it take?
Pardon me?
What would that cost and what would it take?
Reclamation is about $10,000 per acre. And so you can do the math, 10,000 times 119,000 acres. But there would be economies of scale when one can address 100 acres at a time and get those sites, the soil reconstituted and reforested.
Let's go back over to Ted, and then we'll go to Paul and Zach, and then we'll try to get one caller in here if we can. Ted.
I'll just say one thing, it's been our advocacy since the start. We always pushed for dredging. We had submitted comments years back that we wanted to see Exelon obviously to be responsible for this cleanup, but we wanted to see at least 4 million tons of sediments to be removed on an annual basis because, for the last, going back to let's say, 100 years ago, on average, you would see, 10 million pounds or tons rolling downstream, collecting behind the lower Susquehanna River dams. Now, in the last decade, we see about 1.8 to 2 million tons being trapped behind those dams. So if we can, if someone can dredge, that 4 million tons, we would have a net effect of, roughly 2. And if that continues on, in perpetuity, we would have a decent amount of reductions on a manageable basis. And, those numbers could be certainly much higher. We'd love to hear from Harbor Rock and maybe some other companies once they have a little bit more information on exactly how much they can remove on an annual basis. So, it's always been our advocacy since the start. This thing, again, like I said, it's a loaded cannon.
And let me just, for people who's watching, you're talking about dredging where? Let's be specific.
So the Conowingo Reservoir is a 14-mile reservoir from the Holtwood Dam down to the Conowingo Dam. You have about 8 miles of it in Pennsylvania, and you have about 6 miles of it in the state of Maryland. So, that reservoir, we're looking to, dredge behind the dam in that area.
And Paul, go ahead.
I don't know how particularly visionary this is, but might be a little
What have I done here? I've got
outside the box. We advocated as an organization, if Exelon paid even a portion of the payments in lieu under the prior, or a portion of those payments in lieu under the water quality certification, let's shift some of that money from Maryland up to the Commonwealth. Let's help get the reduction on the ground. Let's get the work on the ground, help out the soil conservation districts as partners to the Bay Agreement. Share the wealth. I don't know politically if that's feasible, but it's, again, we need to get this work done. And it's a combination of things that'll get us there.
Zach.
I don't even think we have to be particularly visionary. I mean, kind of the conditions and the money and what we wanted as environmental groups and for the protection and meaningfully addressing this issue was in the water quality certification that Maryland Department of the Environment issued. It's all spelled out there in plain writing. So we don't even have to come up with some long imaginary list of what we want or alternatives. That's really, we just want to go back to that. We were that close to having a meaningful deal, and then MDE dropped the ball. And so this all has to happen in lockstep and in tandem. And if Exelon was willing to sit at the table and provide their fair share, then that adds to our argument of accountability across the board. And then we could move upstream to the upriver dams, and then we could turn the pressure up on Pennsylvania and New York, where this pollution is originating from. But when you have Exelon kind of gumming up the works like this, it makes the rest of that process tough. But while this court case is being fought out and all the subsequent cases and all those next steps, Shore Rivers is going to continue to fight for our downstream communities here, and we're going to continue to install large-scale agricultural restoration practices and work with our local residents and residential homeowners on practices that they can do for nutrient reductions. And we're going to work with our local watermen and our farmers and our local politicians and town councils to make sure that as the downstream communities, we're pulling our fair share of the weight and getting these meaningful nutrient reductions. And hopefully, eventually, Pennsylvania and New York and Exelon and Conowingo will follow suit and do the same. And so we can get to a healthier bay. But it takes that teamwork and it takes that lockstep.
It's important. I'm glad I said visionary. My visionary calling ended up with a lot of practical ideas, which suggestions. It didn't have to be visionary. It's interesting that there's a perspective here before I try to get one caller on who's written here that they would like to say something about Exelon, and I know him, so we'll see what he has to say. But Diane Olson wrote in, the Conowingo Dam was an environmental problem when I worked on Shad Passage 42 years ago. Without good eel populations, there will be no mussel recovery. Mussels are the major factor in cleaning up the Susquehanna and the bay. A really important point. And this is not a new issue. And I think that perspective on the long view is important of what happened before us. But so I've gotten a couple messages here from Arjan Makhjani to talk about Exelon a bit. So let me let Arjan jump into this. And Arjan, we're going to keep it brief. We don't have a few minutes left, but you're going to hear what you have to say. So you can unmute yourself and have at it.
Mark, I just sent you a message that I withdraw the request. I'm fine. I'll give my comment offline.
Okay. Well, I didn't see it, so I'm sorry.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay. So I wonder now, as we conclude this, is to really think about, with all the things you've just said about the practical nature of what can happen, and given the political resistance to allowing these things to happen, what is the strategy going forward to really deal with this issue, and politically how that power is built? Because that's where it's going to lie. And we have an election coming up, and that election is going to be very critical in terms of what happens to the future of our bay, and what happens to Conowingo is going to be wrapped up in this next gubernatorial election in many ways. So, Betsy, let me let you start.
Just to add a little bit of cynicism, Governor Hogan ran on the Conowingo as his issue and did not deliver. So I don't know that an election is going to fix this, but what we need is all of us working on this from every single angle. This is a huge, complex problem. We've got a fantastic team focused on the legal, tiny team, but still fantastic. We need our communities to work on this too. I mean, the situation for the seafood industry, the watermen downstream over on the Eastern Shore where Zach is absurd. They're losing their businesses and livelihoods through no fault of their own. It's just being taken out from underneath them. And not only are they not being taken into consideration, they're just flat shut out of the process. And that's unacceptable. All the people who are bearing the burdens of Exelon's pollution here have been shut out, and we want to fix that. So we hope to get information as widely distributed as possible. We're hoping to do another one of these, hopefully in person, it may be in the early fall. And we want to make sure people know what's going on and how this is going to impact them, so we can stop it. We can reverse the license. We can get a new policy. We can talk to the feds about getting some funding. We can explore the possibilities for dredging and beneficial reuse or reclamation. I mean, those are Superfund sites, right? We need to do something about them anyway. There are a lot of possibilities here, but we have the deck stacked against us in terms of resources. So we need everyone.
Mark, hey Mark, well, I wonder if I might chime in. This is Sam Merrill with Northgate Environmental Management. There are a couple things that I wanted to touch on about this here at the end. One is I'm with this firm, and we are actually leading the Conowingo Sediment Evaluation Pilot Project with Dutra as a joint venture, Dutra, the dredging company, and we're just finishing up. People were talking earlier about, well, what's the sediment like and what are the results? We've just submitted our characterization report to MES and MDE. It's a 1,200-page technical document, and so I know some about that material, and I can, the public release on that information isn't quite out yet, but I can summarize it in general. It's not as bad as a lot of people were thinking it might be. It's not, there's still questions, and like Ted was talking about, there still are reasons to go ahead and dredge. And that's so following through on the governor's original vision, it still does make environmental sense to me and to a lot of others I've been working with and talking to at the state as well. And because of that, the other thing I wanted to touch on was something else that's been brewing in these last couple of years here, which is another group of
I think we might have lost connection there for a minute. We'll come back because we only have like 10 minutes left here, but I wanted to give the panelists a chance to close out their thoughts about where we go from here, which I think is really critical for us to do. Reminding folks as we come out of this before we end is that you can visit the website to get more information about the history of Conowingo and just encouraging you to go to waterkeeperschesapeake.org projects/Conowingo Dam. And you can get information there. And while you're there, I'm encourage you all to stay there and go to waterkeeperschesapeake.org/donate to help push this fight and make it happen. And I think that's really important to get out there before we all fade away to this evening. So let's just go around the room here and kind of close out with some final thoughts here on where we go from here and what you are going to do from here. And I'd like to hear from the legal team first, and then we'll go around the room. So I'll start with Jim and go to Paul.
All right, so the first thing we need to do is get rid of this license. This license locks in a do-nothing regime that will prevent the Chesapeake from ever getting cleaned up. Once we get rid of the license, I think the most important thing to realize is that Maryland has a lot of authority and a lot of power to do good. The Clean Water Act lets Maryland impose all the requirements that are necessary to clean up the bay and the Susquehanna River. And that's whether Maryland, that's whether Exelon likes it or not. That's authority to do it, even over Exelon's objections. And so I guess my closing thought would be, we need to get rid of the license, and Maryland should use its authority to really clean up the bay and do what's right for the Marylanders.
Paul?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't have said it better myself. I mean, we're in this together, and that's the goal. That's the objective. Let's restore this tool to the state of Maryland's toolbox.
And go to the men on the river, Zach and then Ted.
Well, I think where we go from here is I'm going to let the lawyers fight this out in court because that's what they do best. And they understand all these Latin terminologies much better than I do. So I'll let them handle that in the courtroom. And I'm just going to keep continuing to be the voice of these rivers and these waterways and these communities that depend on them until these waterways are adequately protected. And I'll do whatever it takes to clean it up down here and work with our communities and work with our partners until these protections are in place.
Ted.
I mean, I'd say the same thing as Zach, but Jim and Betsy did a good job of summing it up. The only thing I know is this: I'm a fighter, and I got the drive. I have the passion to stay in this fight. And at the end of the day, we don't know how long this is going to take, but this is my if you were to say have a top 3 issues, this is number 1. And it has been. Our organization has been involved since 2009. My predecessor has been working on it since then. We've been involved for 11 years, 12 years now. I'd love to see this resolved in short order, but I know that I'm in it. The colleagues that are around me right now are the best group of colleagues I could ask for. They're smart, they're knowledgeable, and they get stuff done. And that's what it's all about. So I'm confident moving forward.
John Dawes.
Thanks to the attorneys for keeping us on point. You are right. This is the overarching looming threat to the Chesapeake Bay. And any kinds of imaginative, collaborative fixes and use of the sediments are after the fact. And I encourage you to keep up your work. Thank you.
Betsy Nichols, why don't you take this over right now and close out for us? And I just want to say that at least I will not do any more chats over here because we're out of time. But Betsy, why don't you close out for us?
Well, first I want to thank you, Mark, and all of our amazing panelists. we kind of have some jokes in the office about just keep Conowingo on the agenda for every single check-in, because there's always something new brewing to talk about here. But that's because this issue is so important. And if we don't fix this, there is no sort of, backup plan. We really have to fix the situation and get it right. And as we discussed, the legal challenge isn't going to provide us everything we need. We still have a lot of work to do after that. So I don't want people to think like, oh, that's going to fix everything. We still have to explore dredging. We have to do work upstream in Pennsylvania to keep all of the pollution from coming down because they lost all of their mussels. We have to restore those mussel populations that are going to filter the pollutants for us and make it so much easier. All of these things need to be part of the solution, and they're going to have long-term benefits as well. We need Exelon to do their part here and step up and pay their fair share. And it's a David versus Goliath fight. So we need all of you who are tuning in and listening to help us to push in your community, to push political leadership on this. And if you don't want to do those, or you can do all of them, also contribute. We're tiny little organizations working on this. And, it's hard to work on a decade-long issue like this and keep going day to day with everything else we need to do. But I think this is probably going to be one of the most important issues I've worked on in my career, because it really could change the whole future of the Susquehanna River and the Chesapeake Bay watershed, and even, permitting on a whole for federal projects. So that's kind of my last thought on this. Mark, did you have something?
No, I just want to say, I think that we, the little organizations, we have to remember David beat Goliath, and that it can happen here too. And I think that this struggle around the Conowingo Dam has not, as you were just saying at the very end, has national implications in terms of how the fight can go forward for the environment and for the future that all of our kids have to live on. And I think that it's really critical. And I think most people don't realize how central Conowingo Dam is to all of this. And so I'm really happy to be part of this conversation today. I appreciate you asking me to do this. And I apologize I couldn't get to all the chats. There were so many people wrote in. I could not get to everybody. I got to as many as I possibly could to get your voices out here. So I want to thank you, Betsy, for asking me to do this, and thank you all for joining us here for this conversation. And did you have a list of folks that you need to thank before we run out of here?
I think most of them are right here in front of me. So thanks to all of you. Thank you, Mom's Organic Market, for sponsoring this. Thank you to the people behind the curtain, Robin and Bernard, for helping to steer the chat. And the conversation's not stopping here. We're going to keep trying to get as much information out to our communities as we possibly can, and stay tuned for hopefully being able to plan something in person in the future. But thanks all of you for joining us.
Have a great night.